Let me take just a minute to talk about what's going on in the brain that's involving ADHD. In my office, I've got a plastic brain that sits on the shelf, so there's always at least one brain in the room. And I'll pick that up after I've done an evaluation, hold it up and say, look, this is the size of the average person's brain. In there you've got 100 billion neurons. Those are the cells that make up most of the brain tissue. And it's hard for most people to imagine a number as big as 100 billion, but here's a way you can do it. You know, pixels. Most people say, yeah, I know what pixels are, little dots that color makes a picture on TV. Okay, now, on that screen, I'll point to my computer screen, there are about 200,000 pixels. Now imagine if you went down to Manhattan to the World Trade Center before the terrorist attack, when the towers were still standing, they were 110 stories tall. Take one of them. Take that one building and take 17-inch TV sets and set them side by side, bottom to top, all the way up one side, all the way around, so this entire building is totally tiled in 17-inch TV sets, and turn them all on. Add up all the pixels on all those screens. You've got enough pixels to correspond to how many neurons one person has in their brain. We're talking very large numbers here. And each one of these little neurons is linked interactively with about 1,000 others, but they don't touch each other. They're very complicated little subsystems. They have to talk to each other constantly to get anything done. But here's the way it looks. You know, now most of the pictures you see of neurons, there's one only little neuron. You know, this is like a thick hedge going on in the brain. But the action is actually at the level of individual neurons. And the business end of the operation, the place where ADHD really, comes to the rubber meeting the road, is here at that connection point, because the thing is, these little neurons do not directly touch each other. You know, it looks like two mushroom heads butted up against each other, space thinner than a piece of tissue paper in between. And the thing that's amazing about it is the whole system works on low voltage electrical impulses, but these things are not wired together. So here's how it works. I'm going to skip this and I'll explain in a minute. In order to do anything, when you're talking about wiggling your finger, walking across the room, lifting up your fork, reading the newspaper, or riding a bike, there's a whole series of electrical impulses that have to travel along these various networks. And here's the way the messages get carried. The electrical impulse comes along the neuron, gets down here, is going to have to jump this gap like a spark plug. Now, how's it going to do that? Well, there are little bubbles of chemicals, neurotransmitter chemicals, that sit near the edge of each one of these neurons, so that when that electrical impulse comes, it releases microdots of the chemical. That's what crosses the gap, hits these receptors that you see on the bottom. This is just showing you 5 of them, but there are millions of them. And then they aggregate to a certain point where they hit that receptor, and then the next thing that happens is the message goes zipping across, and it continues. But then what's left of the chemical gets sucked back into the sending cell, system reloads in fractions of a second. This is quick. In 1 millisecond, 1,000th of a second, you get 12 messages across. You know, and the system can reload in fractions of a second. Now, there are, of the 50 chemicals the brain makes to do this neurotransmitter job, there are 2 of them that control most of the things that we're talking about as executive functions, dopamine and norepinephrine. Those are the ones that control most of the functions that are impaired in ADHD, and what we believe happens with people who have ADHD is their brains make these same chemicals the same way everybody else's brain does. They simply do not release and reload them effectively. In some cases, they get released and then they get sucked back up too quick. In other cases, there's not enough of it released in the first place. The other thing we know is that about 80% of people who have ADD, if you give them the right amount of the right medicine, this works better. Now, the medicines we have cure nothing. It's not like you have a strep throat, you take an antibiotic and it knocks out the infection. You know, it's more like eyeglasses. I have a problem with my eyes. I can't read typewriter-sized print without my glasses. Put these on, I can read it about as well as anybody can. Take them off, right back where I started. The glasses do not fix my eyes. They just help me see when I've got them on. In the same way, the medicines for ADHD do not cure ADD. All they do when they work is to help a person to be able to do it. How do they work? Up at the top, now we're looking up close and personal here at a synapse. And what you see is there are these little bubbles on the inside, and you just see one of them. And this, let's say this is a dopamine neuron. It's releasing, these little star-shaped things are releasing the chemicals, and they land on these blue rocket ship-like things that are supposed to represent the receptors. And then what happens is they get sucked back. See the two sort of reddish colored things? Those are representing the transporters, which are the little vacuum cleaners that clean the stuff out of the gap of the synapse. Now, what both methylphenidate and the amphetamines do is to slow down that suck back up motion into the presynaptic side, so that when it gets released, for fractions of a second, those medicines allow the transmitter to sit there on the receptor so that it's going to make a better connection. And you don't have that suck it back too fast, so you don't make the connection. Except for what? What you're really interested in, or you feel like you've got a gun to your head for. In those cases, there's plenty of it, and it'll hang out. Now, the difference is the amphetamine compounds also do a second thing. Both of them do slow the reuptake. It's just for fractions of a second. But the amphetamines also have the effect of releasing a little bit more of the dopamine in the first place. Now, for most people, it doesn't matter whether you're using a methylphenidate or an amphetamine compound. They're both going to do about the same thing. But the fact is that there are some people where they don't release enough in the first place, and there the amphetamine may be necessary. So they slow this reuptake or increase the release of dopamine or norepinephrine. That's the way these things work. But the amount you need has nothing to do with how old you are, how much you weigh, or how severe the symptoms are. It's how sensitive is your body to it. And that's where the fine-tuning comes in. That's critically important. Now, there's another thing that we've learned, though, recently about ADHD and the chemistry in the brain, which makes a big difference in our understanding about why it is that a lot of people with ADD cannot get themselves going on tasks that do not interest them. Nora Volkow, in September of 2009, published a study. She's the director of our National Institute of Drug Abuse at this point. A PET scan, where what they did was to look at those parts of the brain in the reward centers where there are receptors that allow us to say, yeah, this is interesting, or yeah, that's something I'd really like to do or find out about. And what they found was that, according to this study, the receptors that normally would contribute to that yeah feeling, there aren't so many of them available in the brains of people with ADD. So what that means is that it's going to take a bigger jolt of the chemicals that say, hey, this is interesting, hey, keep it up, I like this. It's going to take a bigger jolt to be able to sustain those levels of reward and motivation, because we're having more problems with finding enough places to get the message across, literally. And this goes right back to a study she had published 5 years earlier, where they found that they were doing PET scans of normal controls, people who did not have ADD, and they gave them a really boring math test with and without methylphenidate. And when they were doing the task with the methylphenidate, they had a very different reaction, because when they first gave them these boring math problems to do, these were not even complicated problems, it was just there are millions of them. People were saying, oh my God, when is this going to be over? Sort of a typical ADD response to a task like that. And then they could see the parts of the brain that were involved in motivation and reward, they weren't lighting up very much on these imaging studies they were doing, these PET scans. But then they gave them some methylphenidate, and it's like, huh, this is pretty interesting. These math problems I used to think were boring, they're not so bad after all. The methylphenidate enhanced the salience of the task. How did it do it? But it didn't change the problems. It changed the amount of dopamine available in the brain. So if you put those two studies together, the most recent one and the current and the older one, what you see is, if you've got a situation where there aren't that many receptors to pick up the good news that this is interesting, and you don't have enough dopamine getting through, the person's going to say, that's boring, why would I want to mess with that? But if you can jack that up by putting some medication in, which allows a little more of that stuff to get released, or at least allows it to hang out a little bit longer in the synapse, you're likely to be able to stick with it more. And maybe not say, oh, I love my homework, but at least feel like it makes sense to get it done. Rubian, over in the UK, published an fMRI study that compared kids with ADHD against healthy matched controls. And what she found and demonstrated was those with ADHD had too little activation on some tasks and too much on others. and that when you put the medication in, you increase their motivation and attention where it was needed, and you were able to reduce the excesses for both the hot and the cool kinds of motivation. We're beginning to get some imagery studies that are helping us to understand more about what we've known all along about how people operate. So a lot of things change during development. It's the brain development, the unfolding of genes. Genes don't do all their work when we're born. They keep unfolding. The demands of the environment, stressors, and support. So I'm going to stop in just a second, but let me just review quickly some of the changes that I think are occurring as we understand this, even though the DSM-4 is probably not, DSM-5 is probably not going to catch up with them. One is that I'm proposing that we think about ADD or ADHD as a developmental impairment of the unconscious self-management system of the brain. I'm suggesting, as Russ is, that the self-regulation of and by emotions impaired in ADHD, and that's an important thing to include in recognizing it. That the symptoms of ADHD may be noticeable in childhood, but often they're not apparent until the challenges that are encountered in adolescence and adulthood. That this appears to be a problem of not enough willpower, but it's actually a problem in the chemical dynamics of the brain. That the causes of this disorder are primarily genetic, but environmental stressors and supports can really make a difference in terms of how much you see of the symptoms. And I'll be talking a little more later about comorbid problems. This is a foundational disorder that increases the lifetime risk of other disorders as well. So I will be around. I've got a couple of other talks I'm giving here today and a couple more tomorrow. And meanwhile, let me just say thanks very much for your attention.